Welcome, everyone, and thank you for tuning in to another episode of the Recovery After Stroke podcast. Before we jump in, I want to give a heartfelt thanks to all my Patreon supporters. Your ongoing contributions are the reason I can keep this going. And to those of you who've used the YouTube super thanks button, thank you very much. Also, that little heart icon under the video lets you tip the channel. Every bit of support helps me continue creating free content for the stroke community. If you're looking for something deeper on this journey, my book, The Unexpected Way That a Stroke Became the Best Thing That Happened, is available on Amazon or at recoveryafterstroke.com/book. It's been a companion for many stroke survivors navigating the hardest parts of recovery, especially when you need a bit of perspective and encouragement. Now, let's talk about today's guest. Thomas Graham was 66 years old, fit, active, and enjoying life when an ischemic stroke in the pons of his brain stem changed everything. In this conversation, Thomas opens up about how an unaddressed emotional trauma may have played a role, how rehab helped him reconnect his body, and how writing poetry became a lifeline. In an honest, powerful reflection on healing that touches the body, mind, and spirit. Let's dive in. Thomas Graham, welcome to the podcast.
Yeah, good to be here, Bill, with you. And I only learned about you and your podcast in January this year. So it's all pretty recent for me. And, you're doing a wonderful job. And you're reaching out to the world and sharing all our stories. And that's a very good thing.
Well, thank you for saying so, mate. Tell me a little bit about what your life was like before the stroke.
Well, I had my stroke at 66. So I basically had a pretty full life. Um, 66 is quite a good innings, and I was fit, able, um, married, settled in work, enjoying life. Um, Probably worked a bit too hard. You know, one of my weaknesses in those days that I was probably a little impatient. Um, a bit on the go a lot. Um, and then, one day, whammo, got the smack on the head,
Yeah,
which laid
literally.
me low.
Yeah, literally. So, what kind of work were you doing?
Well, most of my life I've been in the cultural sector. So I've worked in a lot of my time in museums, and then I was also a public servant for a while. And then I decided in around my late 50s, I wanted to try something completely different. So I started my own little small business building cat enclosures. So if you, in Canberra, if you own a pet cat, it has to be on your property at all times. So I had a cat and we moved into one of these newer suburbs that had that cat containment policy. So the first enclosure I built was for my own cat. And it kind of opened up a new world for me because, I like the outdoors, I like animals, I like doing things with my hands. It required a bit of uh, creativity and design and spatial design, and it had a people element in that my clients were, um, families or single people. And so I spent 6 years in the back garden of people in Canberra building these cat enclosures. So, and I really enjoyed it. And my final job is when I was struck by stroke. It was quite extraordinary.
Were you at work when it happened?
Yeah, I'd had this client that put in triple glazed windows, and I'd put in their cat door previously and built a tunnel and a cat enclosure. So when they converted to triple glaze, they had there was a problem with the installer around the cat door. So they had four goes at it. So by the time I got there, I'd actually um, sort of retired in a sense, and it was, I drove there like to all my other jobs that I'd done. It wasn't a particularly difficult job. It was not a particularly strenuous job or onerous. It was just making a modification, and it was in the morning, probably around 11 o'clock, beautiful autumn day, and I suddenly felt strange in my head, and I wasn't quite sure what was happening. And so I thought, well, let me just go to my ute and I'll have a cup of tea and things will fade. And when I was climbing up into my ute, I felt like my limbs, my arms were a bit heavy. And then, so I had a flask and I poured myself a cup of tea. And for some strange reason, I started talking to myself out loud. And I heard my speech was slurred. And
Sorry for
that,
laughing. Sorry for
yeah,
laughing.
yeah, you can laugh,
You
mate.
know,
I can laugh about it too now.
I'm not laughing at you, but it is such a ridiculous thing
Yeah.
that you go through the motions and you decide. I mean, it's a brilliant thing you decided, but it's just
Mm.
ridiculous at the same time. I'm going to
Yeah.
start speaking out loud to try and
Yeah.
work out what's going on with me, right? It just does not compute in my mind, even though I've said similar things. Like, it
Yeah.
just does not compute, and I find that it's like a nervous reaction, a nervous laugh and smile as you're taking me
Yeah.
through the story. So you start speaking out loud to try and, what were you thinking when you started speaking out loud? I know what the result may have been, but what were you thinking? Like, how did you come up with that?
I've no idea, mate.
Yeah.
No idea. It's just something was happening to me,
Mm.
and it was a sensation in my head and my body that I'd never experienced before. It wasn't painful. I wasn't say I was scared or frightened. I was just kind of bewildered, and I mean, I can say now I did not know what the symptoms of a stroke were at that point. So, so when I heard my speech was slurred, I thought, well, look, let me phone Bobby, my wife. Um, and immediately she heard my slurred speech. She made the connection. Thomas is having a stroke. And I mean, even that was beyond my comprehension. And she said, well, I'll call an ambulance. And, like probably like a typical bloke, I said, no, you come and pick me up. Now, fortunately, I said, you come and pick me up. And we were only in a neighboring or two suburbs away. So I kind of computed in my head by the time she got there or ambulance got there, she would have got there sooner. So we just left everything, my ute, my gear, knocked on the door, told my client, I've got to get out of here. And, my wife drove me to the hospital. And on the way, I had to stop and I kind of had to vomit, on the side of the road. And at that point, I kind of just surrendered in a way to say, well, I don't know what's happening to me, but I'm going to hospital. And and when we arrived at emergency, my wife went in, found a triage nurse and said, I think my husband's having a stroke. And she came out and I was sitting in the front seat. And she opened the door, looked at me, and then just called it. And then there was this avalanche of medicos that just surrounded me and took me in and started attending to me. So it was a bizarre, freakish, weird, strange experience all round.
That's a
And of course, I
brilliant.
didn't know what the repercussions were,
Yeah,
in the next 24, 48 hours.
yeah, yeah. Do they know what the cause of your specific stroke was? Let's pause for just a moment. If Thomas's story is resonating with you, you're not alone. His reflections on identity, trauma, and creativity are just a reminder that stroke recovery isn't just physical, it's deeply emotional and personal. I want to take a moment to acknowledge my coaching clients. You're showing up, doing the work, and pushing through. I see your effort, and I'm proud of the way you're showing up for your recovery. If these episodes have been helpful for you, you can help me keep them going by supporting through Patreon. Just head to patreon.com/recovery after stroke, and you'll be joining a community that believes recovery isn't just possible, it's worth fighting for. Now, let's get back to Thomas as he shares how he began to rediscover his voice through poetry and how even a locked up hand can become a tool for healing.
Yeah, there I had an ischemic. So in my pons, which is the back of my skull where the spinal column joins. And I know you've had a couple of other guests who's had a ischemic in their pons as well.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
And do they know what caused the clot?
No.
Uh,
So I wasn't anybody who had the typical profile of a stroke victim in terms of potential um, risks. I didn't suffer from high blood pressure. My cholesterol level was in the normal range in those days. I hadn't smoked. I wasn't obese. I didn't have diabetes. Didn't have a history of 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 stroke. My blood pressure was okay, and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
mm.
Um, but age, of course, is a risk factor for men. And
Usually,
also, sorry.
I was going to say, usually I think age is a risk factor because when somebody is older, they tend to have more medical conditions. So as
Mm,
you age, in theory, you have more medical conditions, high blood pressure, cholesterol issues, and I think they all go hand in hand. But
mm.
I would have said that at your age, 66, with no underlying, you know, causes sitting there, no obesity, no smoking, no drinking, or almost retired, hardly working, not a lot of stress. I think, it may have been just something that occurred. They may say they don't know where it came from. They may have named it cryptogenic. I don't think age, though, was the one factor going against you that,
Yeah, I agree. But the one word you used there, mate. So, in the absence of the medicos being able to say, well, this is what caused it, in hindsight, which is always a wonderful thing. Um, I mean, you used the word stress.
yeah.
So I probably, most likely, was uh, managed my life stresses poorly.
Okay.
So over years, probably decades, I was just all this energy that I just contained in me and constricted, literally constricted.
Mm,
So, prior to my stroke, I used to go to bed with my my, my fists and like clenched, or my whole body was like tight
Uh-huh.
and so,
Why was that? Do you know why?
uh, um, well, as I said, a long life of probably containing a lot of negative emotions
Uh-huh.
and not releasing them, not expressing them, um, always probably wanting to be in control. Um, and and then over the decades, that I just got tighter and tighter. And prior to my stroke, I was suffering from a persistent headache, and I wasn't someone who has suffered from migraines or anything like that. So, um, I mean, one of my life factors is that I'm an adopted person. And so, right from day one of my birth, when I was ripped away from my mother, there's been scars and trauma and that that was never addressed. And, over time, those things build up. Um, as
Absolutely.
as you would um, acknowledge, because I've read your book and your story, and
So
yeah,
how
and I think what
how old are you now? How old are you now?
I'm 68 now, so
Okay. So you're an interesting guy. The people that I know in your vintage, so that's only 18 years older than me,
mm,
they don't have these types of discussions about holding on to trauma, about
no, we don't.
emotional turmoil,
No,
about all they don't talk about that kind of stuff.
correct.
You're
No.
very unique for somebody at your vintage. Like what, boomer? Is it a boomer?
Well, a late boomer, yeah, we're
Late boomer.
sort of at the end of the booming
Yeah.
generation, yeah.
Those guys, man, they hold on to their trauma and their pain and their suffering and they don't tell anyone about it. So that's really interesting to hear it coming from yourself. I love it, by the way. It's refreshing, even though I know that it might be difficult for you. It's refreshing to hear somebody say, you know what, we can talk about these things
Mm.
and that you've actually made the connection to what happened to you at 66 uh, might have had some kind of a foundation from birth.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a good word there, foundation. So with that origin. And yeah, look, I've been not when I was doing my Mr. Pittman, but prior to that, I spent about 10 years in the adoption space. Um, and so I've met a lot of adopted people, mothers who, relinquished or gave away their children. And I was a bit of an activist in that space. So it's not as if it suddenly dawned on me post-stroke. I'd, I'd worked in the space and I'd seen the impact of. So if I might just sort of briefly explain, I mean, I was part of the closed adoption era where if your mother was single and pregnant, that in terms of society was an absolute no-no. Unlike today, where single parenthood, single motherhood is just taken as a norm.
Yeah.
But in those days, the mothers were seen as shamed and fallen women, and the solution was to give their child away. Um, and so I was given a new identity and a name. And because I was part of the closed adoption, it was designed that I would never know nor ever be able to meet who my mother was. Now, that is a trauma for a newborn who is in a pre-verbal kind of state without any, cognitive development that comes with aging and things. So, and in a baby's, it's all about sensory, what's inside,
Emotional.
all emotional trust. Yeah, touch, trust, feeling, and that, and it was never addressed because now I was given a very caring, loving, adopted family, of which I'm very grateful for, but it was not something we could talk about in the household.
Uh,
So, and so it was always this trapped energy, and when you went to school and they said, all right, we'll draw a picture of your family. For me, there was always this, and for other adopted people, always this conflict and contradiction between the family we were given and the family that was taken away. And you kind of caught in the middle. So that is, I lived all my life with that. Now, this is not an adoption
no,
podcast, it's a
no, it's
stroke
very
podcast.
relevant, but it's very
But
relevant.
it is really, I certainly think that and believe in my body, mind, and spirit that trapped, constricted emotional trauma that could never be grieved, that loss that could never be grieved during my life kind of just built up like a bloody volcano, and then it exploded when I got the whack on the head.
Yeah. And
So,
and the words that you use are very interesting. The constricted,
yeah,
tight. If you're constricting and tightening a blood vessel
correct,
through your muscles, you're decreasing its ability for blood to flow through.
correct,
And
correct.
therefore, the blood might cause a clot to occur because it's not flowing through freely and efficiently, and therefore that clot can get sent up into the head. And there may, under the microscope, and it may, under scanning situations, it be not obvious and it might be cryptogenic. But what you're describing makes complete sense. It makes perfect sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that because as I described earlier, I was pretty healthy.
Mm,
I ran marathons, mate, in
mm,
my early age. I was, as Mr. Petman, I was building things up and down. As I said, I wasn't unfit, I wasn't unwell, I wasn't overweight,
mm.
and I sort of I ate well, the things you talk about in your book about nutrition and good sleep and but yes, there was just this kind of thing that was trapped inside of me. And and the good thing is that the stroke kind of released it.
Mm.
It opened up a channel that I could kind of let it go in a sense and then work on not only my body to regain my lost movement and things, but also to work on the emotional center and what you talk about or wrote about, the heart, the
Heart
heart
brain.
center and and then for me also, a bit of um, spiritual things, which for me lie in nature, not necessarily in a formal traditional religious pathway.
Mm-hmm.
Um, yeah, so it was. Look, I would not wish a stroke on anybody
Mm-hmm. I know where this is
because
going.
but I do get, the sense of your book with the title, that it offers an opportunity to kind of reframe, recalibrate your life, to make it better for yourself and others.
Yeah. So you woke, so you eventually got to hospital, right?
Yep.
And they've treating you, they've discovered that you've had a stroke. Your wife, Bobby, description was enough to get them looking in the right direction, and they got all the medical team out. They diagnosed you, and then how long did you spend in hospital?
Well, it took a while to, because this is a time of COVID,
Uh,
and I went for a CAT scan. It wasn't obvious where if I actually they couldn't locate the pinpoint where it was. Um, and as you know, whether it's ischemic or hemorrhagic, it makes a big difference in terms of getting the clot buster, thrombolysis, that medication.
yeah,
Um, and so the neurologist made the call to give me that clot buster, and and I was very fortunate to get to hospital within an hour. So for that medication to be effective, which is basically a blood thinners to diminish the damage. Of course, in your instance, man, that probably would have knocked you out permanently.
yeah. I would not
So
have been.
yeah,
Yeah.
so it took, and I think I only got to have an MRI scan about 3 days later because of all the COVID nonsense.
Uh-huh.
But then they could confirm, it was ischemic in the pons, and so the next morning, I went into acute ward. I was there for a week, um, and within 24, 48 hours, I'd lost all mobility to my right-sided limbs, arm, hand, fingers, leg. I mean, I could stand. Um, I could shuffle with support on either side. My arm was in a sling. My hand was frozen. My fingers were frozen. And that was bloody frightening. That was, I don't need to explain to you because, you've probably gone through a little bit more
Same
grief
thing.
and pain, and you've had a few. You didn't do it once, you did a couple of times. So, so
Yeah.
yeah, frightening as hell
Yeah.
to be fully able one day and just lying in that hospital bed the next with sort of half a man, in terms of mobility. It was very scary.
Yeah. And then they realized that, and like they did with me when they realized I couldn't walk or use my left arm correctly, they admitted me into rehab. Did you have a stint in rehab? Were you set to go to rehab for a period of time?
Yeah, yeah. So I went to after a week. We're fortunate in Canberra. They have a rehab hospital with for stroke survivors. So I was transferred there, and I spent another 2 weeks there, and that's where we began with daily focused intensive physiotherapy.
Were you excited about going to rehab? I was. I mean,
Absolutely, man.
yeah.
Absolutely. I did not like hospital
Uh-huh.
because, look, I'm an outdoor person, right? I like the fresh air, I like the open spaces. And it was the middle of winter. So in hospital, it was air conditioner was on, it was hot, my eyes got dried out, it was stale air, the lights were off and on. I didn't have a window, I was in this confined space, and like a hospital, it's just 24 hours activity around you.
Mm.
They'd wake you up every 4 hours, and all they need
Legitimate.
to, and you wake you up and ask you, "Hello, Thomas, do you know what day it is? What time it is?" Now, of course, they're testing your
Yes.
because as a stroke survivor, you could have a relapse, or you could still deteriorate. So they're just checking your cognitive ability, but these simple inane questions at like 4 o'clock in the morning are not always
Yeah.
welcome.
Do you know where you are? Do you know what day and time it is?
Yeah.
Yes, it's 4 in the morning. Leave me to sleep. Get away from there. I know exactly what you mean. And it's so necessary, and they do such a great
Absolutely.
job. But it's so
Absolutely, man.
annoying from a recovery perspective. It's just
Yeah.
so annoying. I hear
I
you.
mean, yeah, I give full credit to all the nurses who looked after me because they were kind and generous and compassionate and, yeah, they were just tremendous.
So what were you doing in rehab to learn how to walk again and use your right side? I had a lot of downtime. At the beginning, they were um uh what were they doing? At the beginning, they were assessing me, and
Mm,
they were trying to work out how bad, for lack of a better word, was my condition so that they could
mm,
make sure that I was safe and that they were giving me
yeah.
the right types of exercises. And all the nurses, all the physios and occupational therapists had all the information they needed about the risks associated to trying to get me on my feet. Um, and I was waiting around for a fair bit of that time. And at the beginning, I was doing rehab only short amounts of time, once a day, twice a day for like 30 minutes. And then
Mm,
as my month of rehab uh, continued to occur, I was having more and more rehab more often,
mm,
and they were testing my ability to cope with that and to see how far they could not push me, but how far they could take me.
mm, mm.
What was your rehab stay like? When did you kind of start getting back on your feet and starting to feel like this was turning around?
Well, it started basically on the first and second days in the acute ward, physio, the occupational therapist, came and did an assessment around my speech and cognition and whether I could drink water and because prior to that I had this gooey, gungy kind of thickened um, water, and then um, the physios, they got me on my feet and took me to a treadmill, put me in a harness, and I began my first slow, short steps, within the first couple of days. And then when I got to the rehab hospital, it was very intensive, um, 5 to 6 hours a day. We
Wow.
had a big gym. There were about 25 um, people in there at any one time. People stroke, some had other medical emergencies, and it was a very humbling experience to be in a space with so many damaged bodies, but the determination of all those individuals to get back on their feet was very inspirational. And the camaraderie between people, the support we gave each other was, yeah, very touching. And so, and then they had to focus on, because my arm was in a sling. So, and, the first, I had to hold out my arms like this for 2 seconds. Now you think 2 seconds is nothing.
Yeah.
Couldn't do it, So because it was all, and they with your arms in it, and they're scared that your your socket's going to fall out, and then
Uh-huh.
that's going to cause other problems. So it was basically about working from the shoulder down to the arm, through the wrist, through the fingers. So with my arm and hand, they actually linked me up to some electronic device FES, functional electronic stimulation, I think. And that was quite amazing because, my hand was lame, but when the electrical charge went through my muscles, my hand opened. And when they switched off the charge, it closed. And that was the start of neuroplasticity, which is another thing I'd never heard of in my life before.
Yeah.
um, that this beautiful brain we have is capable, if something is broken down, other parts can, through that rewiring, which, is a term they use, can bring that function back. So that electrical stimulation of opening and closing my hand got the brain working again. So eventually I didn't need the electrical stimulation. And then it was just, as you would know, and others would know, hundreds and thousands of repetitions of repeating a movement slowly, slowly, slowly. And then also with the wrist, I put my wrist on a rolled towel and had to do this movement. You know, you start with 3 repetitions and you've had it. And then you get to 6 and you slowly build up. So, and yeah, I had to do that with my arm and I had to do with my leg and I had to do that with my foot. And so just every day, just building up slowly and slowly. And then when I lay in my bed as well, with TheraBands, I was tied to the end of the bed and sort of, you know, do lifts and things. So,
So
and look,
you,
I suppose I was fortunate in the sense that I played a lot of sport in my life.
mm,
I was physically active. My last job was building things. So exercise wasn't foreign to me. Um, and and so I kind of warmed to it. And and also I was, when I got to rehab, they asked me what were my goals. And I said, well, I want to get home. I want to walk out of here and I want to be able to feed myself with my right hand. And I had no conception of how long that was going to take. And I just thought, well, whatever they ask me to do, I'll do,
yeah,
because I wanted to sort of be mobile again. And fortunately, my body responded well. And, getting that clot buster injection way up front probably made gave me
massive
a good
difference.
start. And with the treatment and the guidance and my determination, I I am kind of a determined guy, and I was determined to get home, get on my feet, and feed myself again.
Yeah, and it sounds like also the fact that you're always needing to keep active and busy was
Mm.
just another thing for you to just keep doing.
Yeah,
You were
yeah,
you had heaps of downtime. You may as well make it useful.
correct,
And
correct.
also, it sounds like in the book that you sent me that you wrote, which we're going to talk about in a little while,
Mm.
you spoke about your therapists, Elise, Emma, and Mel. It sounds like
Correct.
you had built quite a relationship with your therapists and you had a rapport going, and that they were extremely important in that recovery as well.
Very much so. I mean, I'm sure you would have experienced it, and also a lot of other stroke survivors. When it hits you, you're in shock. You're in deep shock, and I was in kind of disbelief as well. How the hell did this thing happen to me? And I'm lying here, and I've lost half my mobility to my body. So when Elise, the young physiotherapist, came to my bedside and said, Tom, let's go for a walk, which became the title of my book, which I never even thought I'd be writing a book at that point. Um, that when I was sitting with this belief, she instilled belief that you can do this and we can help you. So that was so powerful for me in my, I still choke up a bit when I speak about it because it was so powerful that, when I was sort of broken and vulnerable and just yeah, in shock that someone would come and say that. And, she didn't come and say, well, this is the list that you got to work through. And she just said, let's go for a walk,
Wow.
and that just touched me because,
Mighty powerful.
and so, and they were, and, that young person just believing in me
Mm.
installed that self-belief. And it was the sort of spark that said, well, I've got to do this, I've just got to do this.
What about Bobby? How did she involve herself? Because I know that my wife, when I was at rehab, was dealing with a really shit time in her life. Her mum had just passed away. Her dad was physically disabled, so they had to, the three sisters had to help out in the care of him because he went from having somebody, an in-house caregiver, to nobody living with him. And my wife was also dealing with me having had brain surgery and not being able to walk, being in rehab. So she was coming in and out, and it was really good to see her. I knew that she had a lot on her plate. Okay. All of my issues, all of the issues with losing her mum and her dad being alone at home. But it was a really important part of my recovery, seeing her coming, checking up on me, making sure that I had what I needed, encouraging me, pushing me around in the wheelchair, um, which she loves to do, push me around. What? How did Bobby get involved? How did she kind of step into that role?
Yeah, man. Well, as you know, having those close supports is so, so important. And so Bobby's witnessed my whole journey, from basically from the first hour, because she was the one I phoned and she was the one that picked me up and took me to hospital and witnessed every step of my journey. So, and I sort of mentioned this, when I fell down, she stood up, and that was amazing. So, and also, a lot of other friends and colleagues also and family, offered that support. So,
Mm,
and I suppose I was also conscious that I, I didn't want to be burdensome to Bobby or to others. So I sort of felt that I had a responsibility to do as much as I could to get myself on my feet and active again because others depended on me,
mm,
you know. And I'm sure as a father, you would, you would, you could, align with those sentiments as well. So, and that
definitely.
that was a bit of also a motivation.
With
And
the burdensome thing, like that's interesting because I had those thoughts as well. But reflecting back now, I know that we'll have people very early on in their recovery thinking they don't want to be a burden either. But say that stroke causes you some deficits where you're not walking the same way as before, you're not using your left arm the same way as before, whatever the situation is, you don't, it's not necessarily that you're burdensome to that person all the time immediately. I think I think that is a lovely sentiment to have that you don't want to be a burden for somebody else. And I think even if you're physically disabled, it's important to be the most best version of that new
Mm,
version of yourself that you can,
mm,
so that the burden, so to speak, that you think that you're going to be on another person is diminished, so that you can reduce it, so that you can be somewhat independent, so that you can be somewhat capable, even though it's difficult and hard and it doesn't look like it looked before. So that the so that you're also a member of your caregivers community, so that they're
mm.
caring for you, but you're caring for yourself as well. And you're
Mm.
also doing the best that you can to be less burdensome. And I really don't like that term, but I get where
Yeah.
you're coming from. And it's a sentiment that I held. I just want to give people this idea that you're not a burden
Mm.
and you can improve your situation and you can decrease the amount of reliance, I suppose, on other people. Very, very often you can decrease the amount of reliance. And after a long amount of time, sometimes it'll take longer than we would appreciate or like or want, but things can improve. They can get better. You can find adaptations that will make life um, less burdensome on other people.
Yeah. No, a great clarity there, man. And yes, I do not want to project upon people who
Mm,
have not necessarily recovered as well, or they might have, ongoing deficits to see themselves as a burden.
mm.
Because if that's your current status, that's what it is. And so when I used in the context of the word, I suppose I was using it, and I found it difficult to ask for help.
Ah, okay.
So in that sense, you feel you a burden
Yes.
because you can't do it yourself. But as you would know, and I've seen since my stroke,
Mm,
that asking for help is not necessarily a weakness. It can it can help because there are wonderful people out there that are willing and able to help you, and
that
they don't
sounds like
see
it was,
you, and you don't see you as a burden. But I kind of might have seen myself as a burden.
that sounds like a big breakthrough for you in that
Yeah,
time, asking
yeah,
for help.
yeah, yeah. Asking for help because I always, and it probably also something that came out of the adoption world where I always felt that I had to be very independent and very capable because I kind of felt alone a lot of the time, so and I had to be super resourceful. So being vulnerable at in those early days equated with I'm a burden here.
Yeah. Yeah.
So, but in fact, that was just my own mindset and not necessarily um,
True.
a true, yeah.
Yeah. Fair enough. I totally appreciate that. I know exactly what you mean. So what was the hardest part in rehab for you? Which exercises were the hardest?
Um, Many, many, just um,
Standing on my feet, and there's an exercise
yeah,
they do is they tell you to stand on your feet and close your eyes.
mm,
That's a weird one because
yeah,
balance
just the balance thing, yeah,
goes out, and then
um,
trust. You have to trust that it's not one of those
yeah,
games where they're going to let you go to fall on the ground, which I know it's not, right? But
mm,
that felt really, what's the word, like, oh, really unsettling to close my eyes and try and stand on my own 2 feet.
yeah. I suppose in those early days was to clasp and open. So when we got our breakfast, we had a little 100 ml or 200 ml little jar of milk. to put on the porridge and to to grasp that in the hand and then to open the cap. Because to grip and to turn with my right hand was so difficult. And I didn't want to kind of put it in my teeth and just, you know,
Shred it.
as a workaround. I kind of, and I remember when I could do that and just pour that milk into the porridge and also to lift the spoon to my mouth because as you would know, movement is one thing, control and precision is another thing. So, you're shaking and moving. So, yeah, they were, I suppose for me, was my lost strength and stamina. And I'm still weak. I'm still working on my right leg. Um, so then loss of strength, particularly, when I was so able and probably as a man, as a bloke, um, I found that challenging at times and probably still do. Bobby is probably stronger than me these days.
Be careful.
Yeah.
So I know what you mean because I'm a tradie as well. So I have a painting company and I've had to really step back from being on the tools because
Mm,
my left leg, although they hold me up really well these days, my legs and my arm,
mm,
and that they still, it still has a tendency to fatigue and under fatigue behave in ways that I don't want it to behave. And I mentioned in a couple of my episodes previous to this that I let go of a ladder on the way up to the first level of a scaffold recently. I didn't let go because I wanted to. And my hand just let go and I fell backwards onto my back and I injured
mm.
myself. Um,
Wow.
it wasn't too dramatic in the end, but I was bruised and battered for about 2 weeks, couldn't
Mm,
sleep. And it could have been a lot worse.
mm,
So
mm,
I know what you mean because it does play on my mind. And I have this guilt thing. Now it's not real guilt, it's just man guilt, that I can't be physical and I can't be on the tools while the other boys are. And I
mm,
need to
mm,
step off more than I have and run the administrative side of the business and keep them running and bring
mm,
them the support that they need to get the job done.
mm,
But I'm I'm struggling with the identity change because
mm,
I've always been physical. I've done it for
mm,
20 years in my
mm,
own business, played sport, went to the gym, did all that kind of stuff. And I recently went to the gym and I had a couple of injuries, one in my shoulder, like a little tear, and one in my knee. And and I kind of insisted on continuing to go back, go back, go back. But every time I went back, all I did was aggravate those two injuries.
mm, mm,
And then there was no point in going back.
mm,
But then feeling bad that I couldn't go back. And I
mm,
feel like I need to I'll contact the gym owner and say to him, listen, this is why I haven't been back. I mean,
mm.
some strange stuff goes on.
Yeah.
And the reality is that I need to let my muscles heal before I
Mm,
do more strenuous physical work. And I need to definitely not be on ladders, especially
mm.
tall ladders above a couple of feet off the ground. It's not worth it at all. But try
Yeah.
telling my brain that.
Yeah, we had a leak in the roof recently, and the resistance, I wanted to get the ladder out and climb onto the roof, and I just had to say, no, I can't do that.
Mm, mm.
But the urge to do it, because that's what I would have done in the past, just climb up, look at it, see what could be fixed. And so, yeah, you use the word identity. We have to develop a new sense of self and capability, what we're capable of and what we're not. And the not, it doesn't mean that we're necessarily deficient in any way. It's just that new reality, but that's kind of hard to grasp. And I suppose, I've become more um, open to asking for help, maybe, now, and not feeling, diminished by that.
The emotional work that you're talking about that you did earlier, uh, did that was that happening consistently before the stroke? And then did it ramp up after the stroke, or was it just something that you've been doing for a little while? How did that look?
Well, look, I've done in I've done a lot of emotional um, work in the past, in groups, privately,
Mhm.
doing various courses on things. Um, but I think it ramped up post-stroke, definitely. Um, because as I mentioned earlier, I kind of something freed up in my brain.
I called it my
So
head switched off. I called it my head just switched off, and it made space for my chest and what
yeah,
was in my chest, my heart, to kind of express itself.
yeah,
And previously, it was my head getting in the way, stopping the
correct,
expression from happening.
correct.
And I just felt like there was, I felt this weird sensation in my chest. And at some stage, I realized it was my heart. Like
Mm,
I knew
mm,
my heart was there, but I actually felt it. It's
yeah,
so bizarre after the head went offline and I didn't have the same cognitive ability
mm,
and energy to stifle
yeah,
that voice that the heart
yeah,
was trying to express all this time.
correct. Yeah. So, our minds and, they're important because they let us do all kinds of wonderful things. But when they dominate and they shut out heart and spirit,
Mm,
well, that's when we run into a few problems, as
mm,
you would know, and as I would know as well. So yeah, um, there was a freeing in some sense,
yeah,
So for me, um, and also I think a central message for me is a stroke is a massive um, blow or an expression or statement to slow down,
uh,
slow down. And slow doesn't mean it's bad or it's going to cause you problems because everything in life is fast forward, fast forward. And you would know that in business and life and social media and so and right up front I said I was probably very impatient. So impatience is also about it being wanting everything to be fast or and perfect, maybe. Perfectionism as well was a thing for me. So to just having to simplify and slow down kind of did open up the heart and the spirit to kind of recalibrate what the hell I was doing with my life. And and that's been a positive experience. The sort of the learnings and the uncoverings
yeah.
and the opportunities and things that have emerged.
Probably hard as well, though, some stages, because it's bringing up
Oh,
rawness and emotions that you have to deal with that you're not equipped to
yeah,
deal with.
yeah,
So I imagine there was a bit of, oh my gosh, this is really tough and difficult. But the reward comes after facing those emotional dark
definitely.
places, doesn't it? Like it really comes, you really get rewarded for doing the hard yards and getting the work done and kind of expelling those. I would describe them as um, expelling those like locked,
Demons,
yeah, demons, yeah,
sometimes, yeah,
emotions, yeah, something
yeah,
like that. Yeah,
yeah, yeah. Yeah, and for men, I mean, you right in at the beginning, you said men don't really talk about this
yeah.
stuff and emotions. So, um, I've made a few, public um, talks and things during the process. So early on, I was emotionally kind of vulnerable, and my emotional regulation was a little bit all over the place. So, I'd either be quite tearful, and then maybe I'd laugh just without reason. So when you standing in public and you either doing those things, laughing or crying, it's it exposes yourself.
Oh
So,
man.
and but as you mentioned, you grow from that and you strengthen by that. So it's a kind of a weird thing where when you're very vulnerable, you're actually building inner strength as well.
Yeah.
Um,
You so men really do want to cry. They haven't got around
yeah,
to it yet. They will
yeah,
cry when
yeah.
the timing's right. Hopefully, before it's really dramatic like it was for us. You described using your hand again, walking unaided, writing poetry.
Mm.
W which of those were like the best moment for you? Was it? I mean, like as if you can put them into the best category, one, two, and three. Like you really can't. But which is the most sort of outstanding moment for you?
I will have to group them together,
Yeah,
because it's kind of like full body experience, when the body, mind, and spirit just come together, and it can be, I think, my ability to walk again, to just go outside and of course it was slower and the stride is not fluid or and smooth and then the distance is shorter and but just that ability to just have that stroll, and just feel oneself in motion again, without you know um, supports. And once again, I acknowledge that not everybody might have reached that point in their recovery.
yes,
Um, so I acknowledge that, but for me, that motion, and then um, I'm an introvert, right? So for me to express myself deep inside, that heartfelt things that you've written about and talk about, I had to find an avenue to express that without just jumping up and down and talking to people and, getting on stage and, like a comedian or whatever.
yeah,
That's not me. So that's where the poetry writing came in, right? Because I had um, this profound experience, and I could reason about it and rationalize about it, and I could give you the steps about how to do all this exercise and describe neuroplasticity to you and the brain rewiring. But that didn't really touch my heart, right? Or tap into my spirit. So the catalyst was there in that is in hospital. There was an academic from local university who was offering a poetry writing workshop in wellness and well-being. And this was in my first week. And so I signed up. I mean, I've always liked writing and journaling and things. So there was a small group of us there. And once again, we'd all lost something in terms of our physical nature. Some people were there totally supported by a wheelchair, mechanical wheelchair. Some had suffering from dementia or Alzheimer's. They were losing their capacity to be aware of themselves and things. And I was there in that, sitting in a wheelchair with my arm in a sling. And because we're more than our physicalness, we got a heart, we got feelings, we got emotions, we got intuition. We all wanted to express what we had lost in some way. And poetry was the way of doing that. So in those days, all I could do was type with my one finger into my phone. And
Wow.
because I was compromised in that, things had to be short. I couldn't write a long essay. So my compromise and the opportunity to get creative, poetry kind of came to me as a way of being able to express my state of being and my and this new person I had to, get associated with. And so in the course of my recovery, I just continued that. So I've written a lot of poems, many of them nature-based or nature-inspired, and they have really helped me to find a balance and a stillness and a, a connection with sort of life's vitality and and to build a bit of optimism, because we kind of um, we need to remain positive and optimistic despite our situation, and everyone would be different,
Yeah.
and everyone in a different stage of their recovery. But as wrote or write in your book, to have that positive mindset and a proactive mindset is so critical to to our healing.
When I was writing the book, I needed to put the chapters in an order,
Mm.
not for any reason, but anyone can jump into any one of the chapters in my book and start their journey there. Like they don't have to be at the nutrition part of the journey,
Mm.
or they don't have to be at the emotional part of the journey. Like they can jump in anywhere. Any one of those little chapters is perfect. And then you can work on the other
Mm.
steps in my version of what recovery looked like
Yeah.
for the people who I interviewed and for me. But I've come to realize that putting mindset as the first chapter was more than a fluke. It was
Yeah.
really the most important thing. If you
Mm.
have a mindset that's not supportive of recovery after a stroke, forget about doing emotional work, forget about doing exercise, forget about doing uh, neuroplasticity, forget about any of that stuff. Like nothing happens if your mindset is not
Mm.
correct. And I'm not talking about woo woo 100% positive all the time. I'm talking
Exactly.
about the
Exactly.
majority of the time,
Yeah.
inherently positive, and then
Mm.
sometimes depressed and upset and
Mm.
every negative emotion you want to use to describe that. That's perfectly fine. But overall, the 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 hypothesis of your way forward has to start with my way forward has to start with a recovery mindset and curiosity so that I can find ways and be curious about things that I've never been curious about before so that you can stumble into ideas like poetry that resonate, and your poetry, Repair, for example, the one that you wrote that you called Repair. I mean, it's so poetic. It's so simple. It's lift, lift, lift,
Mm.
repetitions, raise weakened limbs over and over again. Lift, lift, lift. um, willing muscles to move to respond, find their neural connection to fire and ignite familiar movement. Lift, lift, lift. So, what people don't, who are listening to that may not realize is that those words along the same repetition at the same time is firing off additional
Yeah.
neural pathways and
Right.
patterns so that you have a more possibility that the connections, the new firings will
Mm.
stick and we'll
mm,
support recovery. I was doing that when I was lying in my bed. Instead of saying the words, I was imagining myself
mm,
walking.
yeah,
And
yep,
then when I was walking, I was firing off the same neurons again. So in downtime, I was firing off those neurons by imagining it. And in uptime, I was firing those neurons by physically doing it. So they
mm,
had double the
yeah,
rehabilitation at half the price. I mean, it
yeah,
was awesome. And that's kind of what your words do. They offer double the rehabilitation
mm,
with half the energy, because
mm.
doing that, it requires an amount of energy, but talking about it requires way less energy and gets you similar outcomes. Um,
Yeah, man, I think you nailed it there in many of the things you said there. And I mean, just coming back to your book as well, yes, you're having your first chapter as, getting the mindset right, absolutely spot on and beautiful. And if you think about where the medicos focus, and they focus on the physical,
they do.
right? And that's your chapter 7. So, but without that mindset, and yes, as you said, you have bad days.
Mm,
You have shit days.
mm,
You have days where things just don't necessarily work that well, but you stay the course, and with a positive mindset and with that reinforcement, whether it's visualization or some other form of creative expression,
yeah.
you kind of just build that resilience, to keep going.
Yeah. Um, it's exactly what you said. It's like reinforcement, it's like, how do you reinforce with with minimum minimal effort the thing
Mm,
that you just physically tried to do to
mm,
heal and to
mm.
regain and to achieve, right? So it's like, how do you reinforce it? Come up with your own creative way. For some people, it might be painting a walking scene. It might be painting or it might be doing a meditation. It might be using your imagination. It might be writing, whatever it is. It,
Yeah, because
they
just
are,
one on that point, if I might just
yeah,
interrupt there for a minute. We all have different learning styles, right?
yes,
So some are visual, some are auditory, some are verbal, some are physical, some are logical.
yeah,
So it's whatever one that suits you at that time, pull it in, draw it, and use it.
yeah. So why did you write the book? Let's Go for a Walk, Rebuilding Body, Mind, and Spirit After a Stroke. So I wrote my book because I had all these ideas. Speaking about them all over the place was a bit difficult because it's fragmented and you don't really take people through the entire journey that you would love to take them on. A book helps to organize all those ideas and take people through a real journey, right? What was your thinking behind that? I mean, it's a great cover, by the way. Um,
Yeah, Bobby, my wife, she did it from my design, and that's her name. Slabadanka is
ah,
her full name. Yeah.
uh-huh,
So
okay.
we shorten it to Bobby. But
Yeah, I mean, it's very well illustrated. I love the little
and those are
additions
her.
of color, like just,
Yeah, those are her. When she was sitting waiting for me, and when I went into outpatient rehab, and I couldn't drive, and so she drove me, and she used to sit and watch me, and then go to the cafe, and then just sketch. So these are actual sketches from a visual journal or daily journal at the time.
yeah.
And there's a little bit of quirky sense of humor amongst them as well. And
She was going on quite a journey as well with you. Like,
yeah,
she's
yeah,
going through this whole thing with you, like, properly.
yeah. So why did I was kind of it was such a profound experience. And as you would have experienced from you've had multiple strokes.
Mm,
And it's so life-changing and so profound that to to make sense of it first for myself, um, and then getting towards the end of it, I just thought, because Bobby, she sent short emails to people in the beginning, the first 3 weeks when I was out of it. And then I sort of did this journaling at key milestones, like 6 weeks, 3 months, 6 months, 1 year. And and then post that year, I started writing poetry. And then I wanted to kind of draw a line, and say, well, look, this is this phase that I've got through. And the book kind of came out of that to say, all right, we'll put it all together and I can then draw a line and then I can start my new life, as it were.
Love it.
Uh, and so that's how um, it was put together. And I always wanted to write a book, but I never imagined, not in my wildest dreams or my worst nightmares, that it would be about a stroke and my stroke.
Yeah,
So,
I totally
and
get it, mate.
I don't have to say, because you've expressed very eloquently in your writing and your podcast how you neither did you ever think you'd write a book, and you'd never thought you'd have a podcast, and you never thought you'd be this advocate for strokes. So, these are those those unexpected, as the term you used, outcomes and possibilities and options and joyful activities, that our bodies are compromised in some way. We're not physically what we were, and we probably never be, but we are so much more now. And and in touching into our hearts and our spirit, what I also think is very critical. And as you close in your book, stumbling into purpose.
Yeah,
Yeah, you need that positive mindset or engaged mindset up front. And at the end, a new purpose emerges, or a new meaning. And that's what we got to take and build on. And that's what you doing, by opening our stories to the world through your podcast and to other survivors and carers,
yes,
and also the medicos who, I believe do need to hear our stories, because they play a very important role. But once we spit out of the system, we kind of dependent on ourselves and each other to keep going, and to build our lives and our futures.
yeah. I completely agree with that, mate. Like stumbling into purpose, that was the probably one of my more favorite chapters because it was the one you can never plan. You can't really plan that
Yeah.
chapter. Doesn't matter what you read, what you do, and then you just one day you just go, oh, I think helping share stroke survivor stories, creating this community, doing a podcast, writing a book. Oh my God, I think I've found my purpose in life, something I could latch onto for the rest of my life. Like as if my kids are not part of that. Of
Mm.
course they are, but
Yep.
they've left home, so they don't fill the same amount of space that my purpose was created around before. They
Mm.
they've left a little bit of a void because they're adults now and they found their own way and they're growing and they've flown the coop, so to speak. So I had to come up with another way, and what a perfect way um to to develop a purpose was, through my own recovery. I was part of that purpose. It's not just about the other people. It can't be. I can't make my purpose only about helping you and everyone else. I have to be part of that. If it's not giving back to me, then it's not really purposeful. It's some kind of ego trip that you're doing.
Mm. Yeah.
And I'm
Yeah.
not interested in doing an ego trip. What I did was, it was selfish. I started with me. I want to meet stroke survivors so I can learn from them. And then I realized that it doesn't work like that. It's a reciprocal relationship that you have with people. And together we grow and our purposes develop and evolve. And we overcome, and then we help other people. You know what's really cool about this, Thomas, is that people at every level of stroke in their journey have found us. When I say us, I mean you, me, every stroke survivor who I've interviewed, and they're even finding that podcast in hospital while they are recovering from a
Mm.
stroke that they just had in their hospital bed. I mean, that was the ideal for me. If I could reach
Yeah,
people really
yeah,
early on in their journey, that was the ideal. And we've done that together. I couldn't have done it on my own because without people joining me on the podcast, there's no podcast. Me
yeah,
talking about it by myself is boring, you know? So that's what was really cool about it. I love that you wrote the book. I love that you've gone on this journey. I love that you're a late boomer who's talking the language of, um, a Gen Z person or
yeah.
a millennial. It's just fantastic to hear because it's uncommon. And my parents are only, um, my mum is only 10 years older than you.
Mm.
And we don't talk about what happened in her life in the past. And they've been through some harsh stuff.
Yeah, it
Um,
would have.
they just allude to it. They exude love and support and all that kind of stuff, but they've never done their own work. You can
Mm.
tell when you ask the wrong question about a certain topic, things just divert.
Yeah, shut down. Well, I grew up like that where, there was no freedom of expression to talk about your inner feelings. So,
Yeah,
they went within, suppressed, repressed, and then, and over the years they build up, build up, build up, and then,
yeah,
the explosion. So,
yeah.
um, yeah, and we never too old to learn or to unlearn.
Ah,
That's important as well, because some of the things we have to unlearn, the things that trap us and confuse us and shackle us, so it's learning and unlearning. And also, um, uh, just lost my train of thought there for a moment, a stroke moment.
yeah. I know
Um,
them.
what was I about to say? Um,
You were talking about unlearning.
Yeah, unlearning and learning oh yeah, it escapes me, mate. Sorry.
That's all right.
Yeah. Yeah, but oh yes, that's what it was. You know, if when I was lying in that hospital bed, it would have been wonderful if I had known about your podcast,
Yeah,
because for me it's been a bit of a solitary journey, and I'm kind of self-independent, so and because it was so bloody overwhelming, I kept it. But I do now, say to people, because I heard it through David Rowland. He told me about your podcast.
yes.
You've interviewed him twice.
Twice. Yeah, he's awesome, David.
He's another man who's, he's a psychologist. He's also a nature lover like I am. He also writes poetry, and he loves to dance because movement is. And so now I'm I am going out there to talk about my book and stroke. And in all those conversations, I say to people, tap into Bill's podcast. Because you got, because yes, you're up to nearly 400 or
350.
350, and each one of those is you'll find somebody that you have an alignment with in the people that you've spoken to. So
I agree.
it's yeah, what you're doing is really out the top drawer, mate.
Thank you very much, man. I really appreciate the feedback. Look, I love your book. I love your story. Um, if people want to get a copy, they can go to Amazon, any one of the Amazon stores, type in your name, Thomas Graham. Let's go for a walk into the search bar, and that will come up. I know you don't have social media and all that kind of stuff. but we will have the link to the book in the show notes. And then did you have
Just just two things. So the Kindle version is
uh-huh.
through Amazon. If you
Yep.
want a print version, then it's through my wife's website, which is
Ah,
bgpublishers.com.au. I'll send you that link.
yeah. Okay.
So
Perfect.
um, yeah, so the Kindle through Amazon,
Yep.
print through my wife's website.
Okay. All right. Lovely. Well, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast, reaching out. I really appreciated our conversation, mate, and all the best with your recovery going forward.
Thanks very much, Bill. Best of luck for you. I think you're aiming for 1,000 podcasts. So keep going, mate. Keep going.
And that wraps up today's conversation with Thomas Graham, from suffering an unexpected ischemic stroke in the Pons to regaining movement, facing long-held emotional wounds, and discovering poetry as a healing tool. Thomas's story is a reminder that transformation after stroke is possible in ways we don't always expect. To everyone who stuck with the episode, and especially those of you who listened through the ads, thank you so much. I know ads can be a bit of a nuisance, but your support helps keep this podcast sustainable and free for others who need it. If this episode struck a chord, hit like, leave a comment, or subscribe on the YouTube channel. I really want to get above 10,000 subscriptions this year, and we're at about 5,600 at the moment. And if you're listening on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, a quick 5-star review really helps others, other stroke survivors, that is, discover these important conversations. And remember, the unexpected way that a stroke became the best thing that happened is available now. You'll find it at recoveryafterstroke.com/book, or by searching my name, Bill Gassiamas, on Amazon. Thank you again for being here. Keep going. You are doing better than you think. See you on the next episode.
Importantly, we present many podcasts designed to give you an insight and understanding into the experiences of other individuals. Opinions and treatment protocols discussed during any podcast are the individual's own experience, and we do not necessarily share the same opinion, nor do we recommend any treatment protocol discussed. All content on this website and any linked blog, podcast, or video material controlled this website or content is created and produced for informational purposes only and is largely based on the personal experience of Bill Gassiamas. The content is intended to complement your medical treatment and support healing. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice and should not be relied on as health advice. The information is general and may not be suitable for your personal injuries, circumstances, or health objectives. Do not use our content as a standalone resource to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease for therapeutic purposes or as a substitute for the advice of a health professional. Never delay seeking advice or disregard the advice of a medical professional, your doctor, or your rehabilitation program based on our content. If you have any questions or concerns about your health or medical condition, please seek guidance from a doctor or other medical professional. If you are experiencing a health emergency or think you might be, call 000 if in Australia, or your local emergency number immediately for emergency assistance, or go to the nearest hospital emergency department. Medical information changes constantly. While we aim to provide current, quality information in our content, we do not provide any guarantees and assume no legal liability or responsibility for the accuracy, currency, or completeness of the content. If you choose to rely on any information within our content, you do so solely at your own risk. We are careful with links we provide. However, third-party links from our website are followed at your own risk, and we are not responsible for any information you find there.